We prepared that moment, just in case anyone was wondering then. So, okay, so thanks for joining this session. My name's Craig Strong, and I'm actually coming from Pearson. And I'd like to do this before every talk. Just, can I have a quick show of hands of anyone who's heard of Pearson as a company? Okay. Apart from people who work at the FT? Okay. So some of you, but usually, so wherever I go, it's interesting for me how many people sort of know the brand or not. So I just want to give you some context of Pearson as a company. It's a company of 44,000 employees globally. We're in about 80 odd countries. We're defined now as an educational company. Our primary focus is education, and we've got a bunch of learning products and services around that strategy. The actual company is 170 years old. It didn't start as an education company, that's recent. And why I'm saying this is because actually while the company's focused on a different strategy over the last decade or so, there's been obviously acquisitions, mergers and so forth, and that just adds complexity to organizational structures. It used to be in Pearson, the interesting fact, Madame Tussauds used to be owned by Pearson, Chesterton World of Adventure, and all these strange things. So very diverse portfolio. It's not like that now. Although we do have the FT, right? So some of the brands you might recognise with Pearson, very educational based. We've also got investments in The Economist and so forth, so you might recognise some of those brands as well. So, interestingly, one of the key pushes around Pearson, being an education company, not so long ago they announced that actually all investments into our products need to demonstrate learner outcomes. So there's been a whole push on efficacy into the core DNA of the company. So not only do you have to demonstrate viable business models, you also have to prove that products are benefit and have strong learner outcomes. So that's part of the science of testing the products. You have to demonstrate this in order to have investment from the company to go forward. So just show of hands again, how many of you in here would you say work in a big company? Okay, so a good maybe 50% of the room. Or just a show of hands, how many of you have worked in big companies? Okay, so I'm going to go through, so some of this story is very much about, we're trying to transform the organization to adopt a lean startup approach or lean enterprise approach using agile techniques and so forth. So what I'm going to talk about at the moment is some of the problems that we face as in a big company, and it's not exclusive to Pearson. This is what I see in other companies, and hopefully this will resonate with some of you as well, because some of the solutions we're applying are actually in the context of big company thinking, changing the mindset. And Paul, you had an interesting talk prior to this on about how we sort of get this into practices, showing evidence and data and so forth. So some of you might be familiar, in big companies, they take big bets on big ideas. So companies don't generally have a shortage of ideas, but sometimes through politics, through size, through influence and so forth, some of the bigger ideas get bigger and bigger, and sometimes the bigger ideas get bigger investment. And what actually happens is you get this self-perpetuated risk circle where you kind of get big budgets. If you ask for a big budget, guess what? You need to reinforce it with a big plan. And then you start, a big plan attracts big systems, and then you have people, track managers, so you start building up this self-perpetuating risk model, and then it all becomes about mitigating risk. What do you think happens after that in an agile context? You get big agile frameworks. I nearly put it for enterprises there, but I didn't. And some of the problems with this is, from our experience anyway, is that sometimes people look for a model to fit the problem rather than solve the problem. And sometimes, when you're looking at big problems, they're just by the nature of the size of the investment and the scale of what you're trying to do. And having big frameworks doesn't necessarily try to flush out the problems. And this is actually taken from a t-shirt. This is actually a photo of my t-shirt from Agile Alliance in Orlando last year. I was in the session with Carl Scotland. And a big misconception, I actually quoted this on Twitter, and it got printed on a t-shirt the time I came out of the talk, which was pretty cool. But it was the quote which is, just because you have agile teams doesn't make you an agile enterprise. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this. You sort of see, oh, we've got agile teams, we're agile and everything else. but it kind of is constrained around maybe the development teams, the rest of the organization are not necessarily working in iterations and so forth. Does this, hands up if this sounds familiar? Yeah. The strong one at the back. Okay. So this is not uncommon, this is what we see. We end up with something that looks a bit like this. We've got all these other functions around the organization, and we say, right, this is Agile, this is what we do here. But then we get annual budgets, we get HR, how do we move, you mentioned pivoting and so forth. How do you actually pivot? We've allocated this team here and they want to explore another idea, maybe that's not the most viable idea. How long does it take to get someone from this team to this team? And these become massive constraints in organization agility. So some of the problems we're trying to tackle around this space is to see this in the world differently, and that's what we're going to talk about in a moment. Another thing, I think, which has a cultural influence around this, and as we're going through this talk, by all means, just as a warning, I'm going to talk about lots of things quite broadly because we're talking about enterprise. If I hit a nerve and you want to explore it further, please ask questions. So, what I often see as well, and it's a problem that we're trying to solve, I'm in a team which is in what we call the CPO under the Chief Product Officer, and we're a central team vertical in the organization. We don't have our own budgets, we don't fund things, but we work with all the lines of business that do. One of the things that often gets confusing is this, the cultural difference between a project and a product, and it is painful. What we have in the organizations is, and this is not, just as I say that large organizations suffer from this, where we incentivize people around the delivery and time, not the outcome or the impact that makes. And that's what when I'm talking about when we have projects, I sometimes speak to delivery teams, I say, well, are you invested in the outcome? And they say, well, I've got these goals, sales teams have told me this is the information, we're iterating somewhat with customers, but truth be told, with projects, you might move on to the next project, so you're not invested in the outcome. So culturally, these are kind of pain points, and we're trying to solve with what we call in a product life cycle, which I'll come to in a moment. So collectively, this is what happens in organizations as a result of this. Organizations have a finite capacity, like anything else, but because we're betting big, we narrow the funnel of opportunity, because when we bet on big ideas, they take a long time to come through and get validated. We can't rotate, we can't learn so fast. So it actually constrains the capability of the organization to be able to invest in a breadth of ideas coming through. And this is just through traditional governance and so forth of how we operate. Does this sound familiar to anyone else? Yeah. Okay. So I'm preaching to the converted here. This is good. Maybe that's why you gave me the room. Yeah. So fundamentally, I think there's a huge shift going on right now across the world, and it has been for quite some time. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with the quote about the S&P 500. The average lifespan for these Fortune companies now is 15 years, and was it 60 years ago? Is 50 years. So it's a rapidly changing environment. And Mark Andreessen's quote is that software is eating the world. Absolutely. Everything right now we're using pretty much has a software influence. Even if you're not clothing, there's a digital context. You might be experimenting, and I think you might have touched on this with physical items and clothing. You're using sort of digital ways to actually produce physical products. It's not just the digital product itself. And what comes with this is we've got a huge shift in the customers making choices, and the walls of large companies are no longer there. They're actually dissolving. So customers can shift rapidly now to new customers, and these trends exist. So if we don't have capabilities in order to actually tackle resilience over risk adversity, we're not able to respond to the market shifts. So what we see this is in investment strategies. In large organizations, they invest in high probability and maybe a lower impact, and that's just traditional governance. Startups are coming along disrupting this space because they're able to take the bigger risk. They don't have all these constraints, and they're able to pivot and so forth, and it's becoming very disruptive. Where interestingly, startups want to become big companies, or at least bought by big companies. Big companies now want to be like startups. So there's an interesting cycle going on here. But really speaking, if startups want to become big companies for maybe financial incentives in there as well, but if big organizations could release their capabilities and act like startups. They've got all this knowledge and investment and capabilities. Potentially, that could be extremely powerful, and they could maybe build a moat around some of that space if they're able to build in resilience. So has anyone read this book, Big Bang Disruption? Has anyone read this? It's a really good book on about how the digital world's transforming the way consumers adapt products and so forth. What we're saying is that I'm going to talk about a product life cycle in a moment and stages. And when we think of the product life cycle, we think of a visual and you think of this nice sequential, nice little curve growth and so forth. And that's the traditional 60s model of a marketing product life cycle. But actually, through what we're actually seeing today is what they designed as a shark fin. So does anyone remember, did anyone play Farmville? Remember that addictive game? I didn't actually play Farmville, but I know a lot of people did. Well, it was a game by Zynga, Farmville, very high engagement, lots of people. And then another app came along called Draw Something. Did anyone play that? Yeah. So Zynga's payment model at the time was very much in-app advertising and so forth, and that was their money, that was their income. And all of a sudden, within 2 weeks, huge shift of their customer base went over to Draw Something. So pretty much overnight, you had this sharp adoption, and overnight, you had this shift in users. So it ended up, Zynga had to buy them for $170 million, I think, within the couple of months of them coming on the market to actually contain their customer base, because they were shifting away. So that's how rapid these things are now. So when we talk about our practices and governance, particularly in certain spaces, it's extremely disruptive. But interestingly, not only is the investment on the way up where your market can shift to a new product rapidly, it's not gradual like we think, it's also the way down. So sometimes when we talk about investments in organizations, even if we talk about the disruptive up, there's actually a disruptive down. So we have sunk costs, and if we don't think of how we can reuse those costs and come off the platform, we're actually stuck in an investment we can no longer sustain. So word warning. Shark fins are amongst us all. I did have Jaws music, but I don't know if it's actually in the slides. So, what we're doing at Pearson is we're trying to think all of this thinking and bring in Agile, bring wider than development teams into the organisation. Things like beyond budgeting, lean startup, lean into the thinking of natural product development culture. And culture's key. Recognise the link Peter Drucker there. Culture eats strategy for breakfast all the time. So everyone, we focus on strategies and everything else, but unless you've got the culture to support the strategy is going to be ineffective. So it's not something to take lightly. It's something which is in the DNA of the company is the culture, and recognising it and investing in it is key. And it takes time. So, we talked about this in the break for a little bit. One of the things that is really important, and some of the problems we see, is that people focus on outcomes. And we want to shift that, and we are shifting that to principles and outcomes. And that has a huge shift, because that versatility in being able to achieve a goal is essential. We don't have these prescribed processes, one size fits all, and so forth. And switching to principles and outcomes over processes and outputs has a huge cultural effect on how we're doing, and we're starting to see that. Does anyone disagree with that? Yeah. Okay, good. So another thing is interesting in terms of culture, asking questions. When we ask questions, questions can drive behaviours. They also can discover learnings. But it's through questions, rather than going through prescriptive processes and definitions and assertions. Asking the right questions can drive behaviour. We talk about customer engagement. How are you engaging with the customer? What did you learn? These are all questions which drive behaviours, because to answer things like what did you learn, you have hypotheses, you have success criteria and so forth, and these can have a big cultural effect. In large organisations, you get this as well. Language. And I don't mean literally, English, French, Spanish, and so forth. I want about cultural language. You go into finance, you say, hey, I'm a Scrum Master. What does that mean? There's specialist domains across organizations, and they all have their own language. And it's actually really interesting how you can go into one sort of domain and speak about this, a problem, but it's actually the language you're actually coming across in they can't relate to. So one thing that we've learnt is trying to understand the language of the room you're going to go into to actually have a conversation. Because when you talk about, so for instance, I don't want to keep focusing on finance, but finance is an enabler and it's key in this whole process. Going in and saying, you know, I've done my points, I've done, you know, I've spoken to the Scrum Master, the product owner, it doesn't translate. But if you say things like, actually, we're going to, you know, take small increments of finance and we're going to test and we'll talk about, you know, some of the KPIs and maybe in terms of our language. You start building these bridges and you start learning about each other's differences, and that's where you start fixing the problems, and that's what we're seeing at the moment in working with different enabling functions. This is a great idea. So there's loads of ideas that are coming through. I don't think most organisations don't suffer from ideas. They suffer sometimes from the capability to actually work on a number of ideas. But a key thing that we're adopting from Lean Startup, and it nicely follows on from your talk actually before, is actually testing these ideas. Now there might be some ideas which kind of present themselves in such a way you kind of think probably got some confidence that might not be the right thing to invest in to test. However, in some of those things you just don't know, and sometimes it's worth having it, and having data to support that is actually viable. So what we've kind of put into the process and the culture and so forth is actually getting out of the building. The problem doesn't exist in the office, the solution doesn't exist in the office. So when we say this is a great idea and we've got all this knowledge, we've been doing this for 20 years, we know what the customer wants, actually it's a hypothesis. And it's only when you're in the environment that you actually learn whether the hypothesis is true. So we're actually funding people to go into the regions, and we cover like 80 countries, and we see that, you know, if you develop something in North America and deploy it to China, what works well in one culture might not work well in another. Two extremes there, obviously. So we actually encourage people to actually take experiments into the environment and feed that information back and see what the differences are with products, ideas, and experiments and so forth. So any questions so far at this point? Yeah. No questions. Lots of eyebrows, but no questions. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you. I'm in the Global Product Lifecycle team, and we're involved, as I said, as a central vertical in the organisation. And I'm going to talk to you how we're actually trying to encourage this across the culture in terms of the whole investment cycle, the product cycle, and so forth. My next slide, you might smile because I'm contradicting myself, and it's only for the purpose of narrative about this curve. So I said product life cycles don't go like this. Absolutely, they could be completely different shapes and rapid, but for the narrative, I'm just going to explore. So what we're doing in terms of how we develop products using a product life cycle is creating many lenses on our products and portfolios. By using a common language, we're able to see how we're performing on strategy. We're also able to see how a product go to ideas. And sometimes we see things like there's maybe a big framework over here, and people actually, to get there, they jump from idea to grow. So we're trying to stop these kinds of things. And we're able to sort of see how we're doing with innovation. So are we incrementally innovating? Are we, adjacency? Are we, all this? So I'm going to just briefly describe some of the key points that we've got here. This one has been very powerful, and it touches on some of the stuff in the last talk. So what we've got is a very light process, no business plans. Yeah, that's nice. People usually like no business plans, really. We do have information, but it's not in the form of a business plan. It's much lighter. So it's very much about pitching, very light, as a principle, very lightweight, only doing absolutely what's necessary. If someone asks a question, why do you really need to know that? What is it telling you? So there's no, otherwise you end up with a lot of nice stuff, just in case, just in case, just in case, and all of a sudden you end up with a big filter for ideas to go through. So, first thing we ask the things like, can you identify a core problem for the customer? What are you trying to solve? Being a big organisation, we ask things like, is anyone else developing this? Because there might be a problem that emerged in South America, we've got a solution in China, and so forth. So we start doing these lightweight ideas of pitching. If it's on strategy and you actually define your learner outcomes clearly, and this is very light, you go to a phase, you're funded with a very small team to explore. So this is where we apply a lot of, this is kind of the lean startup experimental hypothesis-driven thinking, and this is all about getting out of the building into the environment. And what we do here is encourage people to go and see the problem in its context. So to give you an example of this is, let's just say for a moment, a teacher there's a hypothesis that we're trying to solve a problem for teachers in a classroom. We would say, go to the classroom, observe the problem, ask questions, and we do some customer development activities and so forth, run lots of experiments, and we would be observing many things. So how does the teacher currently solve the problem? And things which will come up there is not just, are they using an app, but how much time do they invest in the problem? Do they spend anything on the problem? Are they the budget over spending the problem? Is the problem painful enough that they would invest in solving it? Because a lot of people have, if you ask people, do you like doing this, they'll say no. But if it's not painful enough and if it's not really a problem, people won't invest in it. So these are all experiments we want to run here. And these things, lightweight things we're encouraging is, does everyone know the Dropbox example, where obviously before they built anything, all they done was just create a video and use that for feedback whether people have the intent to pay. So very much lightweight experiments to get some sort of confirmation. And then when we go into, at this point then you've collected evidence and so forth, loads of pivot in this stage, a lot of learn fast, what we call fail fast, learn fast activities in here, which are, pivot in, stop or continue, change direction and so forth, finding the root of value. When we go into value, then it's all about, you've gone through need validation, now is potentially solution validation. And what's interesting here is that when people get to, I don't know if anyone else can relate to this, but when people start thinking of a solution, they narrow their vision onto a particular one. And not only is that happening, it also narrows the vision on the business model. So something we're being quite deliberate about is when you actually go into solution, we're actually saying we want to see multiple potential solutions and multiple potential business models. And the reason for that is because people naturally focus on a local maxima. And what you might end up with, a really successful business model, a really successful product. However, because you've narrowed into it too early, like premature convergence, you might have missed a bigger opportunity by not having parallel experiments. So we encourage parallel experiments and business model iteration through this process. And then you iterate through this, you get to product market fit. What happens then is that when you go to grow, it's pretty self-explanatory. We're trying to, as fast as possible, reviews on performance. The strategy is a hypothesis, the product roadmap's a hypothesis, and everything else in the feature backlogs and so forth, they're all hypotheses where you test in the data. But what happens is that this forms, an idea, explore, validate, forms an engine of growth. So you might have your growth hypothesis, and we use these three then, as you add into the product, you're kind of using that as an engine of growth for the growth hypothesis. And then you get, obviously, when you get to this point, you kind of, and ignore the shape for a moment, but you kind of get to that point where you've got market established, you've kind of got a good customer base, you've hit your growth point, and it's sustaining that as long as possible. And then eventually retire. And interestingly, actually, what's good about this is that we see a lot of things which, as the shark fins and movement happens, you're able to sort of see reflections on this data quite quickly. And then you can free up capabilities here to invest in new ideas here. So it's kind of turn the loop. So just want to reiterate, this is a non-linear process. It's a really good talk on TED by Linda Hill, who've done some research on Pixar, how they do publishing, and how they do all their stories and so forth. And when they actually try to look at the process, it's kind of this wangled mess. So processes are non-linear a lot of the time. In our case, we go through validate, we learn something, we go through explore, go to grow, maybe a new market opportunity we shift, so it's a very non-linear process. And there's a key distinction in terms of searching and executing. And this is really interesting in terms of, when we talk about the life cycle, we have the first 3 stages and the second 3 stages. In fact, what we have is different activities, searching for a business model, searching for features, and searching for value, requires a distinct set of skills which are exponentially different to executing. So execute in ways more predictable and sustainable. And we have, there's a cultural difference as well. There's sometimes you'll see in teams, there are people who are very comfortable doing this, don't want to do this, don't want to, and completely the other way, very comfortable doing this, certainly don't want to do this. So recognising that in the culture is important as an enabling capability as well. And what we ended up with now, and we've seen this in the governance, is rather than take big bets on the big ideas, what we're doing as a cultural change through this is taking much smaller bets on more ideas. And then as you start proving, as it starts going through, you start to doubling down, that's working, that's not, doubling down, that's working, that's not. So you can kind of mitigate a lot of risk just by having this cycle, removing a lot of the upfront constraint. So this is what I was talking about with business model innovation, going through validate. We would naturally sort of start fizzling it down until you get through validate and you would go through into grow. And even business models can be discovered in grow as well, so it's not a constraint. But it's important to encourage people to do it. In fact, we actually look at if someone's in validate and they've got to grow and they haven't been experimenting, they've got one business model that looks the same as the one they've ended up with, that would be a signal for questions, and we try to discover that early as well. So who's seen this before? Yeah, a couple of you. Why have I put a question mark there? No guesses? So this is a linear process we bet big. You know, going to market, we know the customers want a car, this is what it looks like. This is what we're encouraging through minimum viable products and iterations, building up the customer market, expanding the early adopter range iteratively. Anyone want to take a guess why there's a question mark on there?
Is it because it's on the last iteration?
Could be that, yeah. One of the,
they actually did one bike?
well, you're close. I'll give you a point. Yeah. Sorry? Should it be a car in the first place? Yeah. When we look at this model, there's a fundamental problem with this, and it's a good way to illustrate iterations, but it makes the assumption we end up with the same thing. Actually, that doesn't happen. When you go through the iterative process, you end up with something that looks different because you've got this constant learning loop through the market. So there's a fundamental difference there. And what you might end up with, I'll bet on every time won't be exactly the same. Well, not every time, maybe there's a context there, but in most cases. So the learning loop is actually good to increase the thing. So actually taking the big thinking and making it small and iterating and doubling down changes the outlook of the product. And what we're seeing is, in product teams we've been working with, is that they're learning fast and stopping fast and pivoting fast to the point where, without having we have got innovation teams and innovation hubs and so forth, but in addition to this, by having a cultural practice of failing fast, betting small, and iterating through the engine I mentioned, we're learning faster, so we're able to take on more ideas. So our pipeline, so we've kind of reduced the bottleneck, or expanded the bottleneck somewhat in the beginning, so we can take on more ideas because they're not betting big any longer. What's wrong with this roadmap? That's not a road, but roadmaps are generally planned like this. What's wrong with the picture?
Dip in the road.
Well, there's a dip in the road. There's dips in the road. What else is wrong with that picture? Yeah. No cars in it, maybe. Yeah.
Just one road.
One road.
Can't see what's in the dip.
You definitely can't see what's in the dip, which is a good thing. That's reinforcing the metaphor a little bit. Can't see the destination. Yeah, absolutely. But you can see. So right now, you look down there. You can see something in the distance. You've got a good visual scope. Is there anything else wrong with this road?
The further away it gets, the less you understand.
Yeah. This is really interesting for me because I've just discovered a lot more about this road than I initially realised. The fundamental thing with this road and how roadmaps are discovered, and it relates to this slide somewhat, it's straight. We create linear roadmaps often, and we actually, when we actually create roadmaps, we do this is a milestone, this is a milestone, and we do this. And I know that we sort of change granularity in this, but the thing we're actually actively discouraging is actually roadmaps to actually predict too far into the future of the destination. And actually all they are is a list of questions you have to just keep asking yourself, is it still true? After we've just applied this, is our next assumption still true? So it goes from assertions to assumptions as a culture. So to make this happen, what we're trying to do and what we've been using are things like beyond budgeting and trying to challenge sort of things like annual funding. So, because what we see is the people bid for budgets, they try to spend budgets in the first 3 months, allocate the budgets to projects, and then that confines the ability to interact. HR, as I mentioned, there's obviously an enabling capability there of iterations. So if you're trying to open the funnel up and work on new ideas, then how can all these other functions support that and actually get this iterative model beyond just the development teams in software? And this comes to things like marketing play an important role and sales play an important role, because they've got a lot of market information. But actually things like if you're running experiments, these guys are really good at it. They can get in front, they can do some guerrilla experiments, get feedback quickly without costing the brand, so engaging with these different parties. I didn't have the time to put all the Lego man for all the functions, but you can imagine this is quite a long list. Key thing for this to work, and is taking off quite well, is that we're trying to internalize a coaching program, because actually asking people just to do this and flip a switch isn't easy. There's an expectation of investment of time, and we talked about this as culture and so forth. You can't expect to say, right, we're working this way and it will happen. It will take time, and taking iterations on capabilities and learning and creating this community around this is actually key. So we've got coaching programs around trying to solve this problem, and we're learning a lot about the environment, how people are applying things and so forth. Now when we're on about like one thing has been quite key for us as well, and this is kind of similar to the beyond budgeting metaphor, where what we're trying to do, yes, there is a central strategy. We are a company invested in a certain area of education, but we also agree that when you've got the complexity of 80 countries, different domains, different contexts, different customers, there has to be variance. So what we're looking to, we just do the absolute minimum, keeping the lean thinking, to what questions in the stages of the life cycle, and then we allow extendability in each of the contexts across the organisation. What we then are able to see is commonalities, and if we start saying, hey, everyone's kind of found a way to solve this, because we're not the experts, they are, which is a different approach. If we observe that there's a commonality, we might propose across the community how that would feedback in. Very much an open source software model, designing for its own organisational governance. And the same with practices. Building a community, we'll say, hey, we've done some really interesting stuff with experiments there, can we share that to this community? Because traditionally they're siloed. So the community, now it's really interesting in terms of, now this looks complicated, and it's actually quite simple. But really, in the terms of the illustration, it does look complicated. So all this is basically we're building a community of enabling functions, so finance and everything else. We're not the experts. I certainly am not a finance expert. I'm not an HR expert. I don't know about the publishing as well as the publishers. So what we're trying to do is have this as emergence, build a community of experts, and then have a response mechanism where we have a problem as an organisation. So for instance, how do we iterate in this environment, with this context, with these constraints? We're able to turn to a group of people rapidly and say, can you work together on this problem across the communities, and then feed that back into this. So it becomes a living, the community is very active, it's a living thing. And what's interesting is actually the ideas that are emerging from this are really powerful. And this is a deliberate thing, so we talk about serendipity. Actually, we're actually constructing these serendipitous environments deliberately because they're so powerful for us. And that gives us the capability. It's strange in a global organisation where you find out that someone's invested in something here, or have a question in this part of the world where there's a whole core capabilities in a different part of the world, and just connecting that quickly actually reduces a lot of waste and assumption. So, a couple of points, and then I'll take some questions. We're approaching agility as an organisational mind shift. It's not just a change. You use a framework, you set up your teams. It's actually the whole organisation has to be involved across all the functions to have agility. And this takes a lot of effort. Betting small, not betting big up front, has an effect on the culture and encourages there's a cost to this, which is that to encourage people to bet small and iterate and pivot and so forth, you really need to have a safety net in place. So it goes from, hey, we failed according to the plan, to we've learnt something quick and we've saved the company a lot of money by doing that. So it completely repositions the conversation, and that's something that we celebrate as long as the learning is captured there. As I mentioned, culture is more powerful than strategy, and what we're trying to do is actually use the distributed cognition over centralization to actually get the emergent information back in rather than the other way around, which a lot of companies do. Governance has been really interesting for us because I used to think governance is a dirty word, governance, who likes governance? It's very boring, it's a constraint, it's the thing that slows you down. Actually, if you look at it, change it to questions, keep it really light, and actually try to minimize it. So one of our value propositions, you have to fill in 10 forms. How about if you do one? And we actually work with those partners to just make sure, and it doesn't mean there's one form 10 pages long, I'm not saying that, but you reduce it because large organizations have duplications. And it's actually become an enabler. Asking key questions in there is actually enabling people to connect. And failing fast and experimentation, it helps you learn even faster. So changing everything in the language from a plan, from a roadmap to an experiment and a hypothesis has a huge cultural effect. Because even in our strategy, we're changing our strategy to be, it's a hypothesis, strategic hypothesis. In terms of our product roadmap, it's a list of questions, and in terms of our features, they're just a list of questions too. I wanted to celebrate this. Is probably just for my ego a little bit there, but this came in last night, and I thought it was quite nice. A team just went through some of the training, and I just got this email through last night which said they went through the Idea and Explore, and they've just gone out to Tanzania, and they're working on the X Prize, which is in education this year. And they've gone out into the environment, and they're asking people who live there the questions about certain assumptions they had, and already within a couple of days they pivoted by just doing these lightweight development, lightweight questions through the customer development program. Okay, so I've got some time for questions. Only good questions though. Yeah.
How long has it taken you to get to this point?
Too long. So it took a lot of time. So we actually we engaged with you a long time ago. When was that? It must have been
2 years.
Yeah, 2 years ago. So I think that's when we started our program, and we've expanded the team somewhat. So I think it's probably taken us dedicated team, but a small one. We started with 4 people in January 2014, and now we're 14 people. And it took us probably 6 months to kind of for people to understand the value proposition, and we had to sort of work on the peripheral edge. And then when we started demonstrating the lenses over the portfolio and strategy, that gave a lot of traction. And now we've got commitment from lines of businesses and so forth. So it probably took about, I would say, 8 to 12 months to get proper buy-in. And now it was interesting for us because then we flipped to, now there's all the demand. So we went from selling to executing in a very short time. So we had to shift ourselves as a team to support that. Yeah.
Is it working? How do you measure if it's working?
So that's a really good question. So what we try to do is it's working. We have many sort of metrics as a team and across the organisation. So what we're not doing deliberately is we're not saying, right, roll this out across the organisation. We very much take in vertical slices ourselves and iterating with product teams. So we've just got commitment from 2 lines of business, quite significant lines of business. They'll select 3 to 5 products that are big for them, or actually a collection of products, and say, we're about to invest in this. So there's a success in the adoption, but then we're also in the community. What we're getting is a lot of cases now, and people who are using the practices, sometimes indirectly, because they kind of say, although our business unit hasn't jumped on board as a full sponsor, we're kind of using this now, and we like the practices, and they're sharing case studies. But in terms of, it's also working at a portfolio level, because what we're able to see by having this lens of the stages and so forth is giving us the capability to see where products are. And what's really interesting about that is products which were kind of, we went on an exercise last year and we asked everyone to self-position themselves in the life cycle. And when they actually asked that question, some people said they validate, grow. It changed the way they looked at the products. And so now some of them who thought they were actually in the market weren't, so they've shifted. And because of that, they've learnt earlier in the pipeline if something's viable or not. We've had products which have pivoted, stopped, so actually that's a good thing as well. Also things on the other end where things are not viable, in retire, can we actually release that, and refactor that in to increase the pipeline? So we're getting it working across the portfolio for product teams and the portfolio suite. Yeah, if that answers the question. Go on, Liz. Yeah.
So in the build measure learn process, we've had a problem recently whereby in the kind of validate stage, there seems to be a kind of a fear around a new idea, and people seem to be putting a particularly small amount of users or a very small percentage of a site actually on that particular change or that particular problem, because they don't want it to be too big just in case it causes too much of a problem. This can then mean that A/B test or something can hang around for quite a long time, and because it's on such a small number of people, it doesn't really conclusively prove either way, and either then the code becomes a bit stagnant, it gets taken away,
Yeah.
or it's a bit left. And I'm just wondering how you would suggest getting around that.
So what we do is, what we sometimes find, and so we actually, it's an anti-pattern a little bit for us, is that people kind of are very loose around their experiment, apply the experiment, and then are not sure which direction to go. We actually say, right at the very front, you define your hypothesis and your success criteria there, even things like what is statistically significant for us to make a decision to do this, and what is the time period where we say this is the time we capture it, and this is the numbers we want to see, and this is the statistical significance, and then you're actually quite absolute around that, because if you're a bit fluffy around that, things will just lie in there, and you're actually not learning. So you have to be quite rigid around the time and your hypothesis and your success criteria. So I would make that a bit potentially more structured. I don't know without seeing it, but I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I think in this particular instance, it's somebody who is, or more than one person actually, who's trying to something new before it's become a wider destruction thing. So it means that the way that it's being done is more of I like the idea of doing this like build, measure, learn, but not doing it on a large enough group of people to make it statistically significant.
Yeah, and the funny thing about that, right, is the build, measure, learn. I have a little, you've hit a little bit of a nerve there, because the whole notion of build, measure, learn is in the wrong order. You don't build something, then decide how you measure and learn. You actually decide what you need to learn, how you're going to measure it, then you build. And so it's the actual sequence of that can be confusing sometimes. So it's definitely not build, measure, learn. Yeah. Any other questions?
Also, the question is, what do you consider to be statistically significant?
So in this instance, I believe it was a very, very small amount, or a very, very small percentage of users on a large site. As in, it means that if one person changed their mind and did a particular thing, then actually it then massively sways things. So, I mean, I don't really know how
Probably hundreds.
yeah, as in the hundreds, quite small when you consider a normal site being 5,000 people or something, and instead you then go around and you're trying to make decisions based on a few hundred rather than a large number.
Yeah, so I'd be clear about that up front. Yeah.
A question for you.
Yeah.
Where does your sponsorship come from? So in 6 months of selling this
Yeah.
fragrance tea, you need an air cover, right?
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
So there was a lot of lessons in air cover we uncovered on the way. So we've got it from the CEO and the C-suite now. We didn't initially have it. We had to prove value. I think when we started showing, there's a lot of things going on in the company. I mentioned efficacy. We want to, and the learner at the center. So this was also a way to leverage that capability in the product culture to make sure that we actually putting the learner in the center. So there's a lot of healthy sort of coincidences around that. And then when we started demonstrating iteratively the success, and they were able to see it and see the data from the portfolio and the product point of view, we started getting more buy-in, and we got it from the CEO eventually, and then through the C-suite, and that, believe me, helps. Yeah, you can't do this with one or the other. You have to have both. Yeah, that's the key learning. Question? Yeah.
Earlier on you showed a quote that culture eats
Strategy.
strategy for breakfast.
Yeah.
So in this 2 years then, what do you think has changed in the culture of Pearson that you can point to that's been beneficial?
So I'll answer that in two parts. When we talk about an organisation this big, you can't talk about a singular culture really. There are different cultures within an organisation. what you're trying to do is kind of have a similar culture between them all, but still autonomy. So what I've noticed was changed in certain parts is that there is more of a willingness, there's an admittance that people in the office don't have the answer to the problem, so there's now a much stronger sense, and this coincides with data, there's a much stronger sense actually, yeah, we kind of think this is the answer, but let's get that confirmation, because through some experiments they've sort of seen a disparity. So now that's flipped a little bit, so now rather than make the assumption and defend that, it's actually an expectation in some areas, so we're starting to see people going out without having to think like that, so that's a cultural difference. And I think what we're starting to see is a knowledge sharing capability. So actually when people have, like that email that was unsolicited, it came in, and we've got community platforms and so forth, and you know, where we're trying to encourage this kind of thing, that people are starting to share these stories around, hey, we've failed, but in a story which is, you know, this is actually successful. You know, there was products where we've had catalysts where there was a product where they were developing for quite some time, and they said, hey, you know, if we'd have done the explore, because they hadn't used the life cycle, they said, and validated what our customers were actually saying to us, we did this. So these emergent things have actually started to show differences in the way people approach products. Yeah. I think, how are we doing for time? I'll take that question anyway, but are we good on time? Yeah. Okay, we'll keep going. Let's go. He's rolling. Let's do it. Yeah.
I remember you mentioned there was no business case. So what about roadmaps and what the team's performance at the end of the year, how they are kind of measured against?
So that's a really good question. So when I say we don't have plans, I don't mean we don't have anything. The pendulum hasn't swung, you know, completely the other way. We just have enough. So in the idea, it's a 2-page pitch document, and then there's pretty much 10 core questions at each stage, and there is some evidence, you know, based around it. As teams sort of develop, now there's lots of variance in the product types, environments, and contexts. They develop their own sort of growth metrics and so forth. So they might develop things like, you know, some teams NPS score, they want to make sure that the net promoter score is going up. They want to make sure they got a growth hypothesis. So as they start iterating, they start staged in their own success, aligned with the strategy, of course, and then they have the flexibility somewhat to move against that strategy. So it's a self-defining emergent KPI over time, which changes as well. We're also looking at some interesting things at the moment. I just come off a 4-day course with Dave Snowden and on Conniving and so forth, but it was quite interesting, some of the conversations there about culture and so forth. But actually one of the things that they mentioned on there, and we're looking at as well, is if you're not seeing failures, it's a symptom that people are not taking risks. So ironically, we're actually looking for if a certain amount of failure in people's performance, and to demonstrate learnings from that, because if you don't see any, it's also a symptom of not taking risks. So we also got sort of the flip side of those metrics coming into play at the moment. We're exploring that space. Okay. Honest, I'm really open to all the conversations. If you've got any questions beyond this talk, please get in touch. I'm open to them, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I generally like doing these talks for my ability to learn new things from everyone as well. So any questions you think of, please get in touch. Yeah. Thanks very much.